Before there were names for these people, before historians would label them, before anyone called them the Olmecs, they were simply human, living, adapting, surviving. There is something I keep coming back to as I learn about this period of history. The realization that these people did not know they were becoming history. They didn't know they would be studied. They didn't know their existence would one day become fragmented pieces in museums. They didn't know their world would eventually collapse. They were just living in their present, the same way we are now. Thousands of years had passed since the first humans entered this continent. Thousands of years of movement, of adaptation, of learning how to exist in unfamiliar land, and eventually learning how to stay. By around 2000 BCE, the Gulf Coast of what is now southern Mexico had become something rare. Not empty wilderness, not untouched land, but inhabited, known, understood. This region was unlike the dry deserts of the north, unlike the high mountains of central Mexico. This is lowland, dense, alive, jungles stretched across the horizon. Rivers moved slowly through thick vegetation. The air was heavy, humidity clung to everything. Life was abundant, but survival was never guaranteed. Floods could come without warning. Storms could reshape entire landscapes. Water could sustain you or erase everything you had built. To live here required attention, observation, patience. The people who lived in this region understood this environment in ways we no longer fully can. They knew when the rivers would rise. They knew which plants could sustain them. They knew which areas were safe to build on. Their knowledge was not written, it was lived, passed down through memory, through experience, through survival. And by this point in human history, they were no longer simply moving. They were staying. Maize had changed everything. This plant, something their ancestors had slowly cultivated over generations, allowed for stability. It allowed for food storage. It allowed for predictability, and predictability allowed for permanence. Villages began to form, not cities, not yet, but places where families remained for longer periods of time. Places where children were born into the same land their parents had lived in. Places where memory accumulated. I think about what that must have meant to no longer exist as someone constantly moving through land, but someone belonging to it, not owning it, belonging to it. There's a difference, because when you belong to a place, the place begins to shape you. Your routines, your beliefs, your understanding of the world, your identity, even if you don't consciously realize it. These early communities were not empires. They had no kings as we would later define them, no borders, no nations, but they had structure, social relationship, shared understanding, shared reality, and slowly over generations, those structures began to deepen, not through conquest, not through sudden revolution, but through accumulation. Some settlements grew larger than others, some became gathering places, places where people came not just to live, but to participate in something larger than themselves. Archaeologists would later discover evidence of this shift. Earth shaped intentionally, land modified, terraces built, not just for agriculture, but for organization, for separation, for hierarchy. Hierarchy. That word carries weight, because a hierarchy changes how human beings relate to each other. It introduces differences, not just in ability, but in authority. At some point, certain individuals began to hold influence that extended beyond immediate family, beyond immediate survival. People whose roles were not simply to live, but to lead, to guide, to interpret, to organize. This did not make them gods. It made them humans being operating within new structures, structures that had never existed at this scale before in this region. I think about how gradual this must have felt to the people living through it. There was no moment where they woke up and said, "We are now a civilization." There was no announcement, no declaration, just slow change, generation after generation, one decision building another. until something entirely new had emerged. These people did not know they were laying the foundation for everything that would come after. They did not know their systems would influence civilizations thousands of years into the future. They did not know their existence would eventually become part of my own story, part of your story, part of the story of millions of people living today. They were not trying to become ancestors, they were trying to survive, and in surviving, they created continuity. Something within this environment, within this jungle, within the quiet accumulation of human presence. One settlement began to grow larger than the others, began to organize itself differently, began to concentrate something that had never been concentrated here before, power. That place is what we now call San Lorenzo. Next, we step into the first place where power in ancient Mexico became visible, where human beings began to reshaping the land itself, not just to survive, but to structure the world around them. Part 2. San Lorenzo, where power became visible. There is something different about a place where power once lived. Even if the people are gone, even if the buildings have collapsed, even if the names have been forgotten, something remains, not physically, but structurally, like the land itself remembers. San Lorenzo sits in the lowlands of what is now Veracruz. Today, it does not immediately reveal itself. There are now towering pyramids visible from miles away. No obvious skyline. At first glance, it appears quiet, almost ordinary. Beneath the quiet surface is evidence of something extraordinary. Around 1400 BCE, San Lorenzo began to change, not suddenly, not violently, but intentionally. The people living there began reshaping the land itself. Entire ridges were flattened, earth was moved, elevated platforms were created, not for farming, not for shelter, but for organization, for structure, for separation. There's required labor, coordination, planning. There's required human beings working together at a scale that had never existed here before, and that raises a question that keeps coming back to me. Who organized this? Who decided this should be done? Who had the authority to reshape the earth itself? Because moving earth is not just physical effort, it is social effort. It requires belief, it requires acceptance, it requires people are agreeing consciously or unconsciously that some individuals have the right to direct others. This is where power stops being invisible and becomes physical. San Lorenzo was no longer just a village, it had become something else. A center, a place where humans' effort was concentrated, where decisions carried weight beyond individual survival, where hierarchy was no longer subtle but visible. And then they began moving stone. The nearest basalt quarries were miles away, across rivers through dense jungle. These stones weighed up to 20 tons, the weight of multiple modern vehicles. There were no metal tools, no wheels, no animals like horses to carry the lodge. No animals like horses to carry the load. Only human beings, their bodies, their coordination, their shared effort. This was not random activity, this was deliberate. And from those stones, they carved faces, massive heads, each one unique, each one human. When I first saw images of the colossal heads, I didn't know how to process them. They didn't look like symbols. They didn't look like gods. They looked like people, individuals, with expressions, with presence, with identity. Somewhere what appeared to be helmets. Some had broader noses, some had fuller lips. Each one distinct, not copies, not generic, specific, intentional. These were not monuments to ideas, these were monuments to individuals. Leaders, people whose authorities was so significant that it was carved into permanence, into memory, into the earth itself. And I think about what that means to be remembered like that, to have your existence preserved long after your death. Because most human beings are not remembered that way. Most of our ancestors lived and died without monuments, without records, without physical proof that they were ever here. Their memory survived only through continuation, through descendants, through survival, which means that even my ancestors were never carved into stone. They existed within the same systems, the same structures, the same continuity of human existence that made San Lorenzo possible. San Lorenzo was not an empire, not yet, but it was something new, a place where human society had crossed a threshold, where survival was no longer the only organizing force, where authority had taken form. Archaeological evidence shows that San Lorenzo became the dominant center of this region. Other settlements existed, but San Lorenzo stood apart. It had scale, it had organization, it had permanence. The colossal heads were not hidden. They were placed deliberately, where they could be seen, where their presence reinforced authority, where their existence reminded people of structure, of leadership, of order. This was not just about power in the physical sense. It was about psychological power. The ability to shape how people understood their place in the world, to create stability, to create continuity, to create systems that extend beyond individual lifetime. And yet, the people who lived here did not call themselves Olmecs. The name would come thousands of years later, given by the Mexica, long after San Lorenzo had already fallen silent. The people themselves left no written explanation, no record justification. Only evidence, only stone, only earth shaped by human intention. San Lorenzo reached its height between roughly 1400 and 900 BCE. For over 500 years, it remained the center of power, a place where decisions shaped the lives of thousands, where systems emerged that would influence everything that followed. But power, no matter how permanent it seems, is never permanent. Around 900 BCE, San Lorenzo began to change. Monuments were buried. Some were deliberately damaged. Some were moved, almost as if the people themselves were dismantling something they had once built. This was simply abandonment. It was transformation. Power was not disappearing. It was shifting, moving to another place, another center, another chapter. La Venta. And as I learn about this transition, I keep coming back to the same realization. Civilizations do not disappear cleanly. They dissolve, they evolve, they continue in forms that are not always immediately visible. San Lorenzo was not the end, it was the beginning. The first place where power in the land took shape, the first place where human beings restructured their world in ways that would echo for thousands of years. Next, we follow where that power moved to La Venta, where Olmec civilization would reach its full expression, and where belief, authority, and identity will become inseparable. Part 3. The Colossal Heads and Memory. There is something deeply human about wanting to be remembered, not in an abstract way, not as part of a group, but as an individual, as someone who existed, someone who lived, someone who mattered. At San Lorenzo, and later at La Venta, the Olmecs did something that still feels almost unsettling today. They carved human faces in stone, not symbols, not animals, not imagined beings, people, real people. These are what we now call the colossal heads, massive sculpture, carved from basalt, some standing over 9 feet tall, weighing as much as 20 tons. Each one unique, each one different. Not two are exactly alike. Different facial features, different expressions, different proportions, different presence. These were not copies, they were portraits. When archaeologists first uncovered them, they did not fully understand what they were seeing, because these heads did not resemble the art styles of later civilization like the Maya and the Mexica. They were older, different, more grounded in physical humanity, less symbolic, more personal, and I keep on coming back to the reality of what it took to create them. These stones did not exist naturally in San Lorenzo, they came from mountains. miles away, across rivers, across jungle, moved entirely by human efforts. Without metal tools, without animals to carry them, only human coordination, only human labor, human intention, which means this wasn't just art. This was organization. This was authority. This was a system where human beings could mobilize enormous effort toward a shared purpose. Someone had the ability to command the effort. Someone had the authority to say, this face must be carved. This person must be remembered. This memory must endure. And that changes how I see them. Because these heads are not just sculptures, they're evidence that hierarchy had fully emerged, evidence that certain individuals held power significant enough to be preserved beyond death. I tried to imagine what it must have felt like to live in a world where these heads existed, to walk past them, to see the faces of someone who had ruled, someone whose authority shaped the structure of your reality, someone whose presence remained even after their physical body was gone. These heads made power visible, permanent, undeniable, but they also revealed something else, something quieter, something more personal. They revealed that Olmecs understood memory, understood that human life was temporary, understood that physical existence would eventually end, but memory could be extended through stone, through creation, through continuity. This wasn't about immortality in the literal sense. It was about permanence of identity. The ability to say, I was here, I existed, I shaped this world. And I think about how most human beings never received that kind of permanence. Most of our ancestors were never carved into stone. They left no monuments, no written records, no preserved likeness. And yet, they existed just as fully, just as meaningfully. Their survival is what allowed us to exist now. The Olmec rulers may have been carved into stone, but the people who built those heads, the people who moved those stones, the people who supported that society, they were just as essential. Even if history did not preserve their faces, because civilization is never built by rulers alone. It is built by human continuity, by generation of people adapting, surviving, and participating. A system larger than themselves, and that realization changes how I see these monuments. They are not just symbols of power, they are symbols of transition. The moment human society in this land became structured in ways that would shape everything that followed. These heads were not created randomly, they were placed deliberately, often facing outward, positioned to be seen, to be encountered, to remind, to reinforce. Power was no longer abstract. It had a face. And even today, thousands of years later, those faces remain, watching, existing. Proof that people were real. Proof that civilization was real. Proof that the story that this land did not begin with colonization, did not begin with Mexico, did not begin with Spain. It began here, with human beings shaped stone, and in doing so, shaping history. But these heads were only part of a larger system that extended beyond individual rulers, a system rooted in belief, in cosmology, an attempt to understand forces larger than human control. Because power in Olmec civilization was not sustained by physical authority alone. It was sustained by something deeper, belief. Next, we step into the spiritual world of the Olmecs to understand how they saw reality, how they explained existence, and how belief itself became a form of power. Part 4. The spiritual world jaguars, transformation, and belief. There is something that happens when human beings begin to settle, where survival becomes more stable, when the immediate threat of starvation or moment no longer dominates every waking moment. The mind begins to ask different questions, not just, how do we survive, but why are we here? What controls this world? What forces shape our existence? Because even as the Olmecs built their settlements, Even as they carved stone, even as power became structured, they still lived in a world filled with uncertainty. Storms could arrive without warning, floods could erase entire harvests, disease could take lives without explanation. Nature was not something they controlled, it was something they existed within. And like all human beings throughout history, they tried to understand it, not through science as we define it today, but through meaning, through symbolism, through belief. One of the most powerful symbols that appears again and again in Olmec art is the jaguar. The jaguar was not an animal, it was a presence, a predator that moved silently through the jungle. Strong, patient, unseen until it chose to be seen. It existed both within and beyond human control. To the Olmecs, the jaguars represented something larger than itself. Power, transformation, the boundary between worlds. Many Olmecs carvings show figures that appear part human and part jaguar, not fully one, not fully the other. Something in between. When I first saw these images, I didn't see mythology. I saw interpretation. Human beings trying to express something that could not be explained in simple terms, trying to give form to forces they felt but could not fully define. These figures were often called were-jaguars by modern archaeologists, but the name wasn't theirs. It's an attempt by modern observers to describe something ancient, something deeply symbolic, something rooted in a worldview we can only partially understand. To the Olmecs, the boundary between humans and animals may not have been as rigid as we see today. The natural world was not separate from them. They were part of it, depended on it, subject to it. The worldview shaped their understanding of authority if the world itself was governed by forces beyond human control, then leadership required more than physical strength. It required connection to meaning, connection to belief, connection to whatever forces shaped reality itself. This is where people became more than physical, became spiritual. Certain individuals likely served as intermediaries, people who interpreted signs, people who guided ritual, people who helped communities navigate uncertainty, not as rulers in the modern political sense, but as figures who connected the human world to something larger. And this connection reinforced authority, because if leadership was seen as aligned with the structure of the universe itself, then it was not just social, it was existential. This is something I've thought about a lot. This is something I've thought about a lot as I've gone deeper into this history, because it forces me to confront how different their world was from the one I was raised in, and at the same time, how similar it really was. They did not know about atoms. They did not know about galaxies. They did not know about the scientific explanation we have today. But they still experienced uncertainty, still experienced loss, still experienced existence in a world they did not fully control. And they created a meaning in response, not out of ignorance, but out of awareness, out of observation, out of being human. Because belief is not weakness, belief is adaptation. It is a way for human beings to navigate uncertainty, to create structure where none is guaranteed, to create continuity in a world that constantly changes. The Olmecs express this belief through ritual spaces, through carvings, through offerings buried beneath the earth, objects placed deliberately, not for survival, but for meaning. These acts reinforce structure, reinforce continuity, reinforce identity. This was not religion in the organized, institutional sense we know today. It was a worldview, cosmology, an understanding of its existence itself, and it shaped everything: how leadership functioned, how communities understood themselves, how authority was justified, how power endured. This is what allowed Olmec civilization to sustain itself for centuries, not through force alone, but through shared understanding, shared meaning, shared belief in structure, and yet, even systems built on everything, even systems built on belief, even systems built on structure, do not last forever. Because human societies are not static. They change, they evolve, they transform, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in a way that leave only fragments behind. And eventually, the center of Olmec power would shift again to La Venta, where the civilization would reach its fullest expression before it too would fall silent. Part 5. La Venta, where power reaches its height. Civilizations do not disappear all at once. They shift, they recognize, they continue in a new forms. When San Lorenzo declined around 900 BCE, power did not vanish. It moved east, deeper into the lowlands, to a place we now call La Venta. Like San Lorenzo, La Venta was not its original name. Whatever the people who lived there called it has been lost, taken with them, leaving only what they built behind. La Venta rose from the same continuity, the same inherited knowledge, the same agriculture stability made possible by maize, the same worldview shaped by belief, ritual, and structure. But La Venta became something more refined, more deliberate, more permanent. If San Lorenzo was the emergence of organized power, La Venta was its full expression. The city was built on elevated ground, surrounded by wetlands and rivers, a landscape that was both protective and unpredictable. The people who built La Venta understood this environment. They shaped their city with intention, not randomly, but deliberately. At the center of La Venta, they constructed something that had never existed before in this region, a massive ceremonial mound, what we now recognize as a pyramid. Unlike the later stone pyramids of the Maya or Mexica, this pyramid was made of earth, layer upon layer, built by human hands, requiring immense labor, immense coordination, immense belief in something larger than immediate survival. The structure did not serve as practical purpose like shelter or defense. It served meaning, symbolism, identity. It was physical representation of structure itself, a place where authority and belief became inseparable. And surrounding the central mound, they created ceremonial spaces, open areas where ritual likely took place, where leadership was reinforced, where continuity was maintained. Beneath the surface, archaeologists discovered offerings buried intentionally, stone arranged in patterns, objects placed carefully beneath layers of earth, not meant to be seen again, not meant for display, but meant to exist, meant to remain, meant to connect the present with something beyond it. These acts required intention, they required shared understanding, they required belief in continuity beyond individual lifetimes. La Venta was not just a place where people lived, it was a place where identity was structured, where society understood itself through ritual, hierarchy, and shared meaning. The colossal heads continued here, carved faces, preserved memory, reinforcing authority, reinforcing permanence, reinforcing structure. But La Venta also introduced something else, more abstract carvings, figures emerging from stone, humans' forms intertwined with symbolic features, expressions that reflected not just individuals but worldview. This was no longer just about preserving rulers, it was about preserving understanding, preserving cosmology, preserving identity itself. La Venta became the dominant center of Olmec civilization. Its influence extended far beyond beyond its immediate environment. Other settlements existed, other communities lived and thrived, but La Venta became a reference point, a center of gravity, place where structure was most visible, and I think about what it must have meant to live within the system, to be born into a world where hierarchy already existed, where belief was already structured, where authority was already established, where the system itself felt permanent. unchangeable. Because from within, civilization rarely feels temporary. They feel like reality itself, like the way the world has always been, like the way the world will always be. But history shows something else. All systems change, all structures change, eventually transform, even the ones that feel permanent. La Venta thrived for centuries. Its people lived full lives, raised families, participated in rituals, believed in the world the same way human beings always have. They did not know their civilization would one day collapse. They did not know their names would be forgotten. They did not know their descendants would live in a world shaped by forces they could never have imagined. They were simply human, existing in the present, the same way we are now. And yet, everything they built, everything they structured, everything they believed would shape the civilization that followed, not directly, but through continuity, through influence, through inheritance. La Venta was not the end. It was part of an ongoing process that did not belong to one city, one generation, but to human existence itself. Next, we explore how Olmec influence spread beyond their cities, how their ideas, their structures, and their worldview traveled across Mesoamerica, and how civilization that came later would inherit pieces of what began here. Part 6. The Spread of Influence. Civilization do not exist in isolation. They never have. Even when separated by distance, by jungle, by mountains, human beings find ways to connect, to exchange, to influence each other. The Olmecs were not alone in this world. Other communities existed across Mesoamerica, other villages, other settlements, other people living their own lives, developing their own structure, adapting to their own environments. But something about the Olmecs, something about what they had built, began to move beyond their cities, not through conquest, not through invasions, but through influence. Archaeologists have discovered Olmec-style objects far from San Lorenzo and La Venta. Stone carvings, figurines, symbols, art styles that originated in the Gulf Coast, appearing at hundreds of miles away, in places the Olmecs themselves may never have physically occupied. They did not happen by accident. It happened through contact, through trade, through human movement, through relationships between communities. Trade network formed not like modern roads, not formalized by real paths carved by repeated movement, by people traveling between regions, carrying goods, carrying ideas, carrying culture. The Olmecs traded materials that held meaning, obsidian, a volcanic glass sharp enough to cut through flesh, jade, stone valued not for practical survival, but for symbolism, for identity, for status. These materials moved across distances, through human effort, through trust, through connection. And with those materials came influence. Other communities began adopting elements of Olmec style, not copying blindly, but integrating, adapting, interpreting, taking pieces of Olmec structure and blending them with their own identity. This is how culture inheritance works, not as replacement, but as continuation. The Olmecs did not need to conquer other regions to shape them. Their influence spread through presence, through recognition, through visibility of what they had created. I think about how powerful that is because it reminds me that influence is not always enforced. Sometimes it emerges through naturally. When human beings encounter something that resonates with their understanding of the world, something that expands what they believe is possible. Communities across Mesoamerica began developing their own ceremonial centers, their own leadership structure, their own symbolic system. But the foundation, the earliest visible structure of this kind of civilization, can be traced back to the Olmecs. This is why many archaeologists refer them as mother civilization, not because they created everything that followed, but because they were among the first to establish patterns that others would inherit. Patterns of hierarchy, patterns of belief, patterns of identity tied to the place and structure. And yet, The Olmecs did not know they were becoming foundation. They did not know their influence would outlive their cities. They did not know the civilization like the Maya and the Mexica would emerge centuries later, carrying forward pieces of what began here. They were simply living, participating in systems that made sense within their own present. This realization keeps returning to me because it challenges how I was taught to see history as isolated civilization, disconnected, separate. That is not how human existence works. It is continuous, layered, inherited. The systems we live within today did not appear suddenly. They are the results of countless generations shaping and reshaping reality, often without knowing the long-term consequences of their actions. The Olmecs were not the end. They were part of a process that would continue long after their cities were gone, long after their names were forgotten, long after their monuments were buried beneath the earth. But influence does not require recognition to exist. It only requires continuation. And even as Olmec influence spread across Mesoamerica, even as their ideas became embedded in other societies, their own cities began to change, to weaken, to fall silent, because no civilization, no matter how influential, lasts forever. Next, we explored the collapse of the Olmec centers, not as sudden disappearances, but as transformation, as transition from visible power to inherited memory. Part 7, Collapse. When their cities fell silent. There is something unsettling about the end of a civilization, not because collapse is rare, but because it's inevitable. Every society that has ever existed has eventually changed, dissolved, transformed into something else. Not always through violence, not always through invasion, but through forces that are often quieter, hard to see, harder to understand. For centuries, San Lorenzo and La Venta stood as centers of structure, center of authority, centers of human effort and belief. They had reshaped the land, reshaped human relationships, reshaped what was possible, and then gradually, they began to fall silent. San Lorenzo had already declined around 900 BCE. La Venta continued longer, but by around 400 BCE, it too began to change. Its ceremonial centers were no longer maintained. Monumental construction stopped. Its role as center of power faded, but this was not a single moment, not a single event, not a clear ending. Someone There was no final day when someone declared, "The civilization's over." Instead, life continued. People still lived in the region, still raised families, still survived. But the centralized structure, the visible concentration of power, no longer existed in the same way. Archaeologists have found evidence that some monuments were deliberately buried, some damaged, some broken apart, not by outside invaders, but likely by the people themselves. This changes how collapse must be understood because it suggests something internal, something structural, something human. Civilization depend on stability, on agriculture, on environment, on social continuity. When those conditions shift, systems become harder to maintain. Flooding may have altered the land, rivers may have changed course, and environmental pressures may have disrupted agriculture stability. Population movement may have altered social balance, leadership structure may have weakened, belief systems may have shifted. There's no single explanation. Maybe that's the point. Collapse is rarely simple. It is usually the result of multiple pressures unfolding over time. I think about what that must have felt like to the people living through it. To watch structures that once felt permanent slowly lose their permanence. To witness the systems that organize their world no longer functioning in the same way. They did not know they were living through the collapse of what was now called the Olmec civilization. They only knew that their world was changing, the same way human beings have always experienced change. gradually, personally, uncertainly. And this challenges the way collapse is often portrayed as disappearances, as existence, as failure. But that's not what happened. The Olmecs did not disappear. The centralized cities did, but the people continue. Their descendants continued. Their knowledge continued. Their influence continued. Civilization is not the same as people. Civilization is structure. People are continuity. Structures fall. People adapt. People move. People transform. Has happened over and over again throughout human history, and it's still happening now. The Olmecs did not vanish from existence. They became part of what came next. Their descendants became part of emerging societies across Mesoamerica, societies that would eventually grow into civilization where we recognize more clearly today. The Maya, the Zapotec, the Mexica, and countless others whose names we may never fully recover. Their influence was no longer concentrated in a single city, but it remained evident in culture and belief, in structure, in continuity. And this realization changes everything because it means that collapse is not the end of people. It is the end of a system, the end of a visible form, but not the end of its existence itself. The Olmec did not know they would one day be called the first civilization of this region. They did not know they would be studied, analyzed, reconstructed through fragments. They only knew their present, just as we only know ours. And eventually their cities were reclaimed by the environment. Jungle grew over ceremonial centers. Earth covered monuments. Time buried what human beings had built. Until thousands of years later, their existence would be rediscovered by people trying to understand what came before, trying to understand how this story began, trying to understand themselves. Next, we explore what the Olmecs left behind, not just in stone, but in continuity, in identity, in the civilization that inherited their foundation, and in the people who live today, still shaped by processes that began here. Part 8. Legacy, the civilization that became invisible. There is something strange about legacy because legacy does not always announce itself. It does not always introduce itself clearly. Sometimes it exists quietly. An invisible carried forward without being recognized. The Olmecs did not leave written records. They did not leave names for us to remember them by. They did not leave an explanation of who they believed themselves to be. What they left behind were traces, stone, earth shaped by human hands, fragments of a world that once felt complete. For thousands of years, their cities reimagined buried, hidden beneath jungle, their existence unknown to the civilization that came after, unknown even to the Mexica, unknown even to the Spanish, and yet their influence never disappeared, because influence does not require recognition. It only requires continuation. The civilizations that emerged after the Olmecs, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Mexica, did not begin from nothing. They inherited a world already shaped by human structure, already shaped by belief systems that tied to land, ritual, and authority, already shaped by the understanding that human beings could organize themselves into something larger. The Olmecs did not create these later civilizations directly, but they helped establish the possibility. They helped establish the pattern. They helped establish the foundation. And this is something I keep returning to as I go deeper into this history. The realization that identity is not created in isolation. It is inherited, layered, shaped by countless generations whose names we may never know. I grew up knowing I was Mexican, but I did not grow up understanding what that meant beyond the surface, beyond language, beyond culture as it exists today. I did not grow up understanding how deep the continuity goes, how far back it extends, because modern identity often begins where recorded history becomes clear, with colonization, with Spain, with Mexico as a nation, but the story does not begin there. It continues there. The Olmecs existed thousands of years before colonization. thousands of years before Mexico existed as a political entity. They were part of the continuity that eventually led to everything that came after, including me, including millions of people living today. This does not mean direct lineage can always be traced clearly. History is not that simple. Colonization disrupted continuity, displaced population, reshaped identity, introduced new systems that altered how people understood themselves. But disruption is not erasure. Continuity survives even when it becomes harder to see. The people who lived in San Lorenzo and La Venta were not myths. They were human beings living in their present, navigating uncertainty, building structure, creating meaning, the same way human beings always have. They did not know they were becoming part of something larger. They did not know their existence would help shape civilization thousands of years into the future. They did not know their influence would extend beyond their own lifetimes. They were simply living, and in living, they became part of continuity. I think about how easily history can feel distant, abstract, disconnected, especially when it is taught as something separate from us, something that belongs to the past, instead of something that continues to shape the present. Learning about the Olmecs has changed how I understand identity, not by giving me simple answers, but by removing illusions. The illusion that identity begins with nations, the illusion that history begins with colonization, the illusion that the past is separate from who we are now. The Olmecs are not part of a forgotten world. They are part of an ongoing story, a story that did not end when their cities fell silent, a story that continued through countless generations, a story that eventually became modern Mexico, a story that eventually became me. And this realization is not about claiming something that is not mine. It is about understanding continuity, understanding that existence itself is inherited, that survival itself is inherited, that identity itself is inherited, even when memory is incomplete. The Olmec did not need to be remembered by name to matter. Their existence shaped the conditions that allowed everything that came after. Their influence remained embedded in the structure of human continuity in this land. They became invisible, but they did not disappear. Maybe that is what awakening really is, not discovering something new, but recognizing something that was always there. I'm Ruben Alamán, and this is De Quienes Somos.